Hi and welcome. You are listening to Listen and Relax. Sit back and enjoy scary neighbor stories. If you want us to continue making these videos, let us know in the comments what you think about the stories. Please like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay updated when we post new exciting stories. These stories are all based on true stories. Thank you for listening. The Neighbor Who Hated Dogs. In a quiet apartment complex in the heart of Chicago, two neighbors were locked in a bitter feud that had everyone on edge. On one side was Mrs. Emily Carter, a kind-hearted woman in her 50s who lived with her loyal Labrador Max. On the other side was Rupert Hayes, a reclusive man in his 60s who seemed to have a deep-seated hatred for Max, and increasingly for Emily herself. It all started innocently enough. Max was a friendly, energetic dog who loved to greet everyone he met with a wagging tail and a happy bark. But from the moment Rupert moved into the apartment next door, he made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with the dog. "Keep that mutt away from me," he'd snap whenever Max got too close. "I don't trust him." At first, Emily tried to be understanding. She kept Max on a short leash whenever they passed Rupert's door and made sure to clean up after him meticulously. But no matter what she did, Rupert's hostility only grew. It started with shouting. Every time Max barked, whether at a squirrel outside or a passing delivery person, Rupert would storm out of his apartment and scream at the dog, accusing him of being aggressive and dangerous. Then came the accusations. "Your dog bit me," Rupert claimed one day, holding up a bandaged hand. Emily was stunned. Max had never bitten anyone in his life. She tried to reason with Rupert, but he refused to listen. Instead, he began leaving angry notes on her door, demanding that she get rid of the dog or face the consequences. Fearful for Max's safety, Emily installed a security camera in the hallway outside her apartment. She also started documenting every interaction with Rupert, determined to protect herself and her dog. But as the weeks went by, Rupert's behavior became more and more erratic. One night, Emily woke up to the sound of banging on her door. She peered through the peephole and saw Rupert standing there, his face twisted with rage. "Your dog's been leaving hair all over my doorstep," he shouted. "I know you're doing it on purpose." Emily was terrified. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, Rupert had retreated to his apartment, leaving behind a small pile of dog hair as evidence. The final straw came when a dog behavior specialist was called in to assess Max. The expert quickly determined that Max was not aggressive, just a little overly enthusiastic. But Rupert refused to accept the verdict. "It's not just the dog," he muttered during the hearing. "It's her. She's the problem." The judge wasn't convinced. He issued a restraining order against Rupert, barring him from contacting Emily or going near Max. If he violated the order, he faced a hefty fine, up to $10,000, and even the possibility of being evicted from his apartment. The other tenants in the building breathed a sigh of relief. They had all witnessed Rupert's behavior and were firmly on Emily's side. As for Emily, she broke down in tears when the verdict was announced. "I just wanted to live in peace," she said, her voice trembling. "I never thought it would come to this." But even with the restraining order in place, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She still caught Rupert glaring at her from his window, his eyes filled with resentment. And sometimes, late at night, she'd hear strange noises outside her door. Scratches, whispers, the sound of someone breathing heavily on the other side. Max would growl, his fur standing on end, and Emily would hold him close, wondering if the nightmare was really over, or if it was just beginning. The hidden camera. It was Christmas Eve in the small town of Willow Creek, Vermont, and 19-year-old Claire was excited to capture the holiday festivities on video. Her family had a tradition of recording their celebrations, the gift exchanges, the laughter, the cozy moments by the fireplace. But this year, there was a problem. Her video camera was broken. Desperate not to miss the memories, Claire decided to ask her landlord, Mr. Thompson, if she could borrow his. Mr. Thompson lived in the apartment downstairs, a quiet man in his 50s who kept to himself. He was always polite, if a little odd, and Claire had never had any reason to distrust him. When she knocked on his door, Mr. Thompson seemed hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to lend her his camera. Just make sure you return it in one piece, he said with a tight smile. Claire thanked him and hurried back upstairs. As she set up the camera, she noticed there was already a tape inside. Not wanting to invade Mr. Thompson's privacy, she discreetly set the tape aside and used a new one to record her family's Christmas celebrations. After the holidays, Claire returned the camera to Mr. Thompson, making sure to include the original tape. She thought nothing more of it until a few months later. One evening, Claire decided to watch an old movie and record it on her now-repaired camera. As she rummaged through her collection of tapes, she came across the one she'd found in Mr. Thompson's camera. Curiosity got the better of her, and she popped it into her VCR. At first, the screen was blank. Then, suddenly, an image appeared, a grainy, shaky video of a bathroom, Claire's bathroom. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what she was watching. The camera was positioned in such a way that it captured everything: the sink, the shower, the bathtub. And there, in the center of the frame, was Claire herself, completely unaware, completely exposed. The video had been filmed months ago, back when she'd first moved into the apartment. She remembered those mornings, getting ready for work, singing to herself, thinking she was alone. But she hadn't been alone. Someone had been watching her. Trembling with fear and anger, Claire rewound the tape and played it again, trying to figure out where the camera had been hidden. The angle was strange. It seemed to be coming from behind the large mirror above the sink. With a surge of adrenaline, Claire grabbed a hammer from the kitchen and marched into the bathroom. She stared at the mirror for a moment, her reflection staring back at her, wide-eyed and pale. Then, with a cry of rage, she swung the hammer and shattered the glass. Behind the mirror was a hole, just big enough to fit a small camera. The wires snaked back into the wall, disappearing into the darkness. Claire felt sick to her stomach. She stumbled back, clutching the hammer like a weapon, her mind racing. How long had the camera been there? How many hours of her life had been recorded without her knowledge? And worst of all, what had Mr. Thompson done with the footage? She called the police immediately. When they arrived, they searched Mr. Thompson's apartment and found a collection of tapes, dozens of them, each labeled with dates and names. Claire wasn't the only one who had been watched. Mr. Thompson was arrested that night, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling of violation. She moved out of the apartment as soon as she could, but the memories of what she'd seen on that tape stayed with her. Even now, years later, she avoids mirrors. She can't help but wonder if someone is watching her from the other side. The butcher next door. When 17-year-old Bart moved to the tiny town of Pine Hollow, Vermont, he thought it would be a fresh start. The town was quiet, the people were friendly, and the rolling hills and dense forests made it feel like the perfect escape from the chaos of the city. But it didn't take long for Bart to realize that Pine Hollow had its own dark secrets. It started with whispers. Bart had made a few friends at his new high school: Jake, who lived down the road, and Femke, a girl with piercing green eyes and a nervous energy. One afternoon, as they walked home from school, Femke suddenly stopped and pointed to a rundown house at the edge of the woods. "Stay away from that place," she said, her voice trembling. "That's where the butcher lives." Bart frowned. "The butcher?" Jake nodded grimly. "Yeah, they say he kills animals, strays, pets, anything he can get his hands on. He's even got a freezer full of, well, you don't want to know." Femke's eyes filled with tears. "He killed my cat, Mittens. I know he did. She went missing last year, and a week later, I found her collar in his yard." Bart felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at the house, its windows dark and its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. It looked like something out of a horror movie. Over the next few weeks, Bart couldn't stop thinking about the butcher. He started noticing strange things, like the way the man would drag heavy garbage bags into his house late at night, or the faint smell of something foul that seemed to linger around his property. One evening, Bart, Jake, and Femke decided to spy on the butcher. They hid behind a cluster of trees, their hearts pounding as they watched him carry another garbage bag into his house. This time, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Sticking out of the bag was the unmistakable shape of a rabbit's head. "Oh my God," Femke whispered, clutching Bart's arm. "I told you, he's a monster." The sight was enough to convince Bart that they couldn't just stand by and do nothing. The next day, they went to the police, but the officers just shrugged it off. "Old man Grayson, he's harmless," one of them said. "Probably just hunting rabbits or something." But Bart and his friends weren't convinced. They decided to take matters into their own hands. Late one night, they snuck onto Grayson's property, armed with flashlights and a camera. They were determined to find proof of what he was doing. The house was even creepier up close. The paint was peeling, the porch was littered with broken furniture, and the air smelled like decay. As they crept around the side of the house, they found a basement window that was slightly ajar. Bart hesitated for a moment, then pushed the window open and climbed inside. The basement was dark and damp, with a concrete floor and walls lined with shelves. And there in the corner was a large chest freezer. With trembling hands, Bart lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of plastic bags, each one filled with something shapeless and dark. He reached for one, but before he could open it, a voice rang out behind him. "What do you think you're doing?" Bart spun around to see Grayson standing in the doorway, his face twisted with rage. In his hand was a bloody knife. The next few moments were a blur. Bart and his friends scrambled to escape, barely making it out of the house before Grayson could catch them. They ran all the way to the police station, where they finally convinced the officers to investigate. When the police searched Grayson's house, they found more than just animal remains. Hidden in the basement was a collection of trophies, collars, tags, and even photographs of pets that had gone missing over the years. Grayson was arrested that night, but the experience left Bart and his friends shaken. They had uncovered the truth about the butcher next door, but it came at a cost. Even now, years later, Bart can't shake the memory of that freezer, or the feeling that there are more secrets hidden in the shadows of Pine Hollow. The neighbors. Since my divorce, I've been living in an apartment. I'd rather have a small house with a yard, but I'm grateful to have a place to call home. Not everyone is that lucky. Until recently, I had great neighbors. But then the woman next door moved out, and Raquel and David moved in. The day they arrived, they knocked on my door to introduce themselves. The moment I opened it, a wave of sweat and something else, something sour, hit me like a brick wall. They just stood there, staring. It was as if they were waiting for an invitation to step inside, but they weren't really looking at me. I forced a polite smile and muttered something about them coming over if they ever needed anything. I regret that now. I don't want them here. They are unsettling. I hear them fighting in the stairwell, loud, angry arguments at the strangest hours. One time, I was coming home late, and I saw them standing near my door. The moment I stepped closer, they turned to me with sharp, accusing eyes. "You're so rude," Raquel hissed. "You didn't even say hello." I had barely registered their presence before she snapped at me. Stammering, I managed a quick greeting, but their glares lingered long after I shut my door. From that moment on, I started avoiding them. They rarely go out in the mornings, so I plan my grocery trips then. If I need to leave in the afternoon, I listen carefully, waiting to hear their door open and close. If I know they've just left, only then do I feel safe enough to step outside. "That's not a healthy way to live," my sister told me when I mentioned it on the phone. I know she's right, but I can't shake this feeling, this awful, crawling feeling that I don't want to run into them. Ever. Because I don't think they're just strange. I think they're watching me. And I don't know why. Last night, something strange happened. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard a soft scraping noise outside my apartment door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard whispering, low, urgent voices just outside. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone. The whispering stopped suddenly, and then came a soft knock. Not the kind of knock you give when you expect someone to answer. No, this was slow, deliberate, almost testing. I held my breath, gripping the sheets tightly. I didn't move. After a few seconds, I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. In the morning, I checked my peephole before opening the door. The hallway was empty, but something small caught my eye. A single deep scratch ran along the bottom of my door as if someone had been pressing something sharp against it. I called my sister and told her everything. Maybe it was just a prank, she said, trying to reassure me, but I could hear the worry in her voice. That night, I double-locked my door and left the lights on. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that Raquel and David weren't just watching me anymore. They were waiting for something, and I was terrified to find out what. The man across the hall. 2 years ago, I moved into my own apartment. It's part of a complex with 3 buildings, and I live in the front one. Directly across the hall from me lives him, the neighbor I wish I could ignore. From the very beginning, he made me uncomfortable. At first, it seemed like he was just overly friendly, always eager to chat whenever I stepped outside. But soon his behavior became invasive. If I parked my car, he'd rush over and yank the door open before I even had time to react. The first time it happened, I nearly screamed. Since then, I've learned to lock the doors before turning off the engine. He rings my doorbell constantly. I used to check the peephole and sometimes open the door, but I don't anymore. Because when I did, he wouldn't just stand there, he would try to step inside. This man isn't entirely normal. After a severe car accident years ago, he lost part of his hearing and developed balance issues. He doesn't work, isn't allowed to drive, and barely has any visitors. Some people feel sorry for him, but I don't. Because pity doesn't erase the way he looks at me, or the way he touches me. The first time, I thought it was an accident, a light brush against my lower back, but it kept happening. A hand on my arm that lingered too long, fingers grazing my hip when he helped me carry in groceries. Then one day, he tried to kiss me. I recoiled, pushing him away, my voice sharp and firm. He just laughed, said I was too sensitive. I told him clearly, multiple times, that I wanted nothing to do with him. I even yelled at him once to stay the hell away. He didn't listen. One evening, after a long day, I pulled into my usual parking spot. My heart sank when I saw him already outside. As I opened my door, carefully, cautiously, he lunged forward. This time I was ready. I slammed the car door right into his chest. He stumbled back, eyes wide with shock, gasping. I didn't wait around. I locked the door and ran inside. I thought maybe, just maybe, that would be the end of it, that he'd finally take the hint. But if anything, it's gotten worse. Now, when I leave my apartment, I sometimes hear movement behind his door. Heavy breathing, the shuffle of feet. I know he's standing there, waiting. The other night I heard knocking, frantic, aggressive knocking, followed by my name, called over and over again. I didn't answer. I stayed in bed, heart pounding, listening as he paced outside my door for what felt like an eternity before finally retreating to his own apartment. I've tried everything, telling him off, ignoring him, even getting my ex-boyfriend to have a firm conversation with him. Nothing works. Now I'm scared to leave my apartment at all. I called my sister to ask what I should do. She suggested I file a complaint, but what if that makes things worse? He may be disabled, but he's not oblivious. He knows exactly what he's doing. And worst of all, I think he enjoys it. The man in the hallway. When my girlfriend and I moved into our new apartment, it felt like a dream come true. It was spacious, modern, and in a quiet neighborhood. We had found it through a well-known housing corporation, so we assumed it was a safe, comfortable place to live. We were wrong. From the very first day, we had an unwanted visitor. The son of our elderly neighbor, an old woman suffering from dementia, began ringing our doorbell multiple times a day. At first, we thought he was just checking in, maybe introducing himself. But his behavior quickly turned strange. On our first day of moving in, he accused us of stealing a laptop. Another time, he knocked to inform us that his mother had been the victim of a violent robbery, something we later found out wasn't true. He always had a reason to come by. He wanted to check our heating system, help us with our furniture, or bring over small, unprompted gifts. Flowers, ice cream, a newspaper we never asked for. He seemed to know exactly when we were alone. We tried to be polite at first, but as the days went on, his visits became more frequent, more insistent. Within 48 hours, he had already stood at our door at least 10 times. Every time we heard the buzzer, a cold knot formed in my stomach. We stopped answering. Then came our first night in the apartment. We were exhausted, looking forward to finally sleeping in our new home. But as soon as the clock struck 11, we heard movement outside our door. The hallway light flickered as footsteps echoed in the stairwell, back and forth. back and forth. For over an hour, he paced outside, his shadow slipping under the crack of our door. My girlfriend and I lay in bed, barely breathing. Then at midnight, the doorbell rang. Not once, not twice, again and again in rapid succession. We clutched each other, frozen in place. He didn't call out, he didn't leave. We could hear him standing there, just beyond the door. After what felt like forever, the ringing stopped. We waited, listening, until finally we heard him shuffle away. But we didn't feel safe. Instead of sleeping, we decided to get out of the apartment for a little while, to clear our heads. We tiptoed to the door, slowly, quietly unlocking it. Just as we stepped outside, we heard movement. He was there. The moment he heard our door open, he turned. Even in the dim hallway, I could see the way his face changed, his lips curling into something that was neither a smile nor a frown, but something in between. Something wrong. "Going somewhere?" he asked. We panicked. We blurted out something about catching a bus and practically sprinted past him, our hearts hammering in our chests. When we reached the street, we didn't look back. Later that day, some of the other residents approached us. Quietly, almost hesitantly, they warned us about him, about his unpredictable behavior, about the way he watches. We called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. He hadn't broken any laws, just boundaries, and that, it seemed, wasn't enough. The excitement of our new home was gone, replaced with unease and fear. Every time we hear the buzzer, we go still. Every night, we wait for footsteps in the hall, because we know he's watching, and we don't know what he'll do next. The man over the fence. At first, our neighbor seemed like nothing more than an eccentric older man. He lived with his wife in the house next door, and while she was friendly, always waving when she saw us, chatting about her garden, he was different. He watched. Whenever my mother and I stepped into our backyard, he was there. Not in an obvious way, not standing directly in view, but we could feel his eyes peering over the fence. Sometimes we would catch glimpses of him, just the top of his head or the shadow of his shoulders as he shifted to get a better view. It made us so uncomfortable that we started timing our outdoor activities around his schedule, making sure we wouldn't be outside at the same time. We never confronted him. Something about him felt off. Even though his wife was always kind, it felt like a fragile balance that we didn't want to disturb. Then the complaints started. He had an opinion on everything we did in our yard. When we planted flowering bushes along the fence line, he was furious. "Now I can't see into your yard anymore," he had grumbled, as if that was a perfectly normal thing to say. When my mother fed the birds, he accused her of attracting disease and pests that would ruin his garden. But the most ridiculous complaint of all, the autumn leaves. Every fall, the city provided free leaf piles for residents to use in composting, and we always collected some for our garden. We kept them neatly contained, tucked away in a compost bin where we also kept our chickens. Yet every year he would complain that our leaves were blowing into his yard, making his life harder. Never mind the fact that he had his own tree dropping leaves everywhere. Our leaves were the problem. It wasn't just the leaves. If he was in a bad mood, he would grumble about our cats too. My mother and I had 9, though we kept them indoors most of the time. We were meticulous about cleaning, ensuring there was never a trace of cat smell. Most people had no idea we had more than one. Yet, he seemed obsessed with them. He would mutter about calling the city to report us for having too many. His complaints never amounted to much. But the feeling of being watched, the constant criticism, the way he always seemed so aware of what we were doing, it wore us down. One evening, I stepped outside to bring in the laundry. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the yard. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. Then I heard it. A quiet rustling, the sound of someone shifting their weight on the other side of the fence. I turned my head, and there, just barely visible through the gaps in the wooden slats, I saw his eyes. He was standing inches from the fence, pressed up against it, staring at me through the cracks. My breath caught in my throat. For a second, neither of us moved. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. I bolted inside, my heart pounding. I told my mother, and we agreed we needed to do something. We reinforced the fence, made sure he couldn't peer through anymore. But even now, whenever I step outside, I can't shake the feeling that he's still there, watching, waiting. The watcher next door. In the quiet town of Maplewood, nestled in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, there was a house on Willow Lane that no one dared to visit after dark. It wasn't haunted by ghosts or cursed by witches. It was something far more real, something human. The trouble began in the summer of 2019, when Emily Carter and her two young children moved into the cozy blue house at the end of the street. They were excited for a fresh start, away from the noise of the city. But their excitement quickly turned to unease when they met their neighbor, Mr. Grayson. Mr. Grayson lived alone in the house next door, a crumbling Victorian with overgrown hedges and curtains that were always drawn. He was a tall, gaunt man in his 60s, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. At first, Emily thought he was just a lonely old man, but soon she realized there was something deeply unsettling about him. It started with small things. Emily would catch Mr. Grayson staring at her children from his porch as they played in the yard. She'd hear strange noises at night, knocking on the walls, footsteps in the attic, even faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, she brushed it off as her imagination. But then the incidents grew worse. One evening, Emily's daughter, Lily, came running inside, her face pale with fear. "Mommy, Mr. Grayson was watching me from his window," she said, trembling. "He had a camera." Emily's heart sank. She rushed outside to confront him, but by the time she reached his house, the curtains were closed and the lights were off. She called the police, but without proof, there was little they could do. Over the next 2 years, the harassment escalated. Mr. Grayson would bang on the walls at all hours of the night, making it impossible for Emily and her children to sleep. He installed security cameras that pointed directly into their yard, claiming it was for protection. He even began leaving strange gifts on their doorstep: a broken doll, a single black rose, a note that simply read, "I'm always watching." Emily felt like a prisoner in her own home. She stopped letting the kids play outside and installed extra locks on the doors and windows. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Grayson was always there, lurking just out of sight. In 2021, Emily finally had enough. She filed a restraining order against Mr. Grayson, and the police warned him to stay away. But he didn't listen. One night, Emily woke up to the sound of scratching at her bedroom window. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she pulled back the curtain, and there he was, his face pressed against the glass, a twisted smile on his lips. The police arrested Mr. Grayson the next day. During the trial, it was revealed that he had been filming Emily and her children for years, documenting their every move. The judge was horrified by the extent of his actions and sentenced him to community service, a suspended jail sentence, and a restraining order that barred him from coming within 500 feet of Emily's home. But even after he moved away, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced she heard footsteps outside. She'd catch glimpses of a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, she could swear she heard the faint sound of a camera shutter clicking in the dark. The neighbor in the alley. It all started on a warm summer night in the small town of Cedar Creek, Illinois. I had been out with friends, celebrating nothing in particular, just enjoying the freedom of a Friday night. By the time I stumbled home, the streets were empty, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. That's when I saw him. He was leaning against a lamppost at the end of my street, tall, dark-haired, and undeniably handsome. His smile was easy, his eyes glinting with mischief. We started talking, and before I knew it, we were kissing under the pale glow of the streetlight. It was impulsive, reckless, and exactly the kind of thing I thought I'd never do. "Come back to my place," he said, his voice low and inviting. I hesitated for a moment, but the alcohol had dulled my better judgment. "Sure," I replied, laughing. "Why not?" We walked down the street, and to my surprise, he stopped just 3 doors down from my house. "This is me," he said, gesturing to a narrow townhouse tucked between 2 taller buildings. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, what were the odds that my one-night stand would turn out to be my neighbor? But as the weeks went by, I realized just how small my street really was. It wasn't a proper street, more like an alley, with houses so close together you could hear your neighbors sneeze. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't avoid him. At first, it was just awkward. I'd see him taking out the trash or walking his dog, and we'd exchange polite nods before quickly looking away. But then, things started to get strange. I'd catch him standing outside my house at odd hours, just staring at my windows. Once I woke up in the middle of the night to find him sitting on my porch, smoking a cigarette as if it were the most normal thing in the world. When I confronted him, he just smiled and said, "I couldn't sleep. Thought I'd keep you company." It was unsettling, but I told myself I was overreacting. After all, he was just a guy who lived down the street. What harm could he really do? Then the gifts started showing up. At first, they were small things. A single red rose left on my doorstep, a handwritten note slipped under my door, but soon they became more personal. A photograph of me taken through my kitchen window, a lock of hair tied with a ribbon, a voicemail at 3 a.m. with nothing but the sound of heavy breathing. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was all in my head. But deep down I knew the truth. He wasn't just a neighbor, he was a predator, and I was his prey. One night, I decided enough was enough. I packed a bag and called a friend to pick me up. As I waited on the curb, I felt a pair of eyes burning into the back of my skull. I turned around and there he was, standing in the shadows of his doorway, watching me with that same twisted smile. "Leaving so soon?" he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. I didn't respond. I just got in the car and drove away, vowing never to return. But sometimes late at night, I still think about him, about the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to know everything about me. And I can't help but wonder, is he still watching? The Neighbor's Secret. When I was 13, life in our quiet neighborhood took an unexpected turn with the arrival of new neighbors. A young couple in their 30s moved in next door, bringing along their lively 4-year-old twins. As the youngest in my family, I often felt the pangs of loneliness, wishing for siblings to play with. The twins seemed like the perfect opportunity for me to finally experience that joy of companionship. I remember how eager I was to impress them. I would peek out from my bedroom window, watching as the neighbor would walk to his front door. I would wave, and he would wave back, his smile always friendly. Even now, as I write this, a chill runs down my spine thinking about those innocent moments. One day, the neighbor came knocking on our door, asking my mother if I would be interested in babysitting. My heart soared, but just as quickly, it sank when I learned that they were planning to move before they even needed a babysitter. Then one Friday evening, the phone rang. My mother answered, her face a mix of curiosity and concern. The neighbors were at his in-laws' house just around the corner and wanted to know if I could watch the twins while they went out for dinner. My mother hesitated, but I pleaded, "Please, please." Before she could change her mind, I was in the neighbor's car, excitement bubbling inside me. But as the engine roared to life, I felt an unsettling shift in the air. We weren't heading toward his in-laws. Instead, we drove away from the familiarity of our street. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled, but there was something off about it. "Oh, it's just a little detour. We're going to my parents' place, not hers." At that moment, I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. I knew he was lying. Just like every other 13-year-old who realizes that Santa Claus isn't real, I understood that something was terribly wrong. As we drove deeper into the darkness, I could hear the faint sound of music playing in the background, Ruth Jacot's voice echoing eerily in the silence. Eventually, we arrived at a secluded parking lot, the kind that felt abandoned and forgotten. I recognized it. It was the parking lot by the pool, a place I had visited with friends countless times, but now it felt like a trap. Panic gripped me as I sat there, listening to him talk about how infatuated he was with me. All I could think about was how to keep him calm, how to avoid making him angry. You see, fear isn't always about the immediate danger. Sometimes it's about the knowledge that you're trapped with no way out. I was just a girl, and I felt the weight of that reality pressing down on me. It's a realization that doesn't care about age or strength. a truth that lingers in the hearts of many young girls. In that car, I understood that fighting back could lead to something worse. I was 13, and I was terrified. Thankfully, nothing more than unwanted advances occurred that night. I was lucky. As I look back now, I realize how fortunate I was to escape that situation with my life and my sanity intact. But the memory lingers, a shadow in the back of my mind, reminding me of the darkness that can hide behind a friendly smile. The watcher in the shadows. In the small, sleepy town where I grew up, there was an old house that had been abandoned for years. The village children often whispered about it, spinning tales of ghosts and mysteries. One day, I noticed that the old place had a for sale sign outside, and my curiosity was piqued. Who would dare move into such a spooky house? As the days turned into weeks, I kept a watchful eye on the property, peering out from behind trees and fences, eager to see who would come to call this eerie place home. Then, one afternoon, I saw her. A small girl, no older than 8 or 9, with wild hair and a strange, unsettling smile. I watched in horror as she approached a pigeon that had landed nearby. To my disbelief, she lunged at the unsuspecting bird, grasping it with small, nimble fingers. What happened next was something I would never forget. She brutally killed the pigeon, her laughter echoing in the still air as she began to drain its life away, her eyes glinting with a darkness that sent chills down my spine. I froze, my heart beating wildly in my chest. I was caught. She had seen me watching. Panic surged through me as I turned to run, but I could hear their footsteps behind me. The girl and her family were coming after me, and I could feel their intent, sharp and predatory. From that moment on, my life spiraled into a nightmare. I couldn't shake the fear that clung to me like a second skin. I tried to confide in my parents, hoping they would understand the terror that had taken hold of me. But when I told them what I had seen, they simply exchanged glances filled with an unsettling calmness. "It's just a child being a child, dear," my mother said dismissively. "You're overreacting." But it felt like more than that. I could see it in their eyes. Something had changed. They weren't the same. My father, usually a pillar of strength, seemed distant, lost in thought, as if he were hiding some terrible secret. The warmth of my home began to feel cold and unwelcoming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my parents were somehow involved in the darkness surrounding the new family. Days turned into weeks, and my fear transformed into paranoia. I started to notice strange things happening around our neighborhood. Shadows flitted past my window at night, and sometimes I could hear whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I felt like I was being watched, and the girl from the old house was always at the back of my mind. One evening, I decided to confront my fears. I would sneak back to the old house and find out what was truly happening. As I crept through the overgrown grass, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The air was thick with an unnatural silence. I peered through a cracked window and saw the girl inside, surrounded by her family. They were all smiling, but their eyes held a sinister glimmer. It was then that I realized the truth. They weren't just a family, they were something else entirely. They were part of that darkness that had seeped into my village, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. As I turned to run, the door creaked open behind me. I glanced back and saw the girl standing there, her smile wide and terrifying. "You shouldn't have come here," she said sweetly, her voice echoing in the night. I fled, my heart racing as I sprinted back home, but the feeling of dread never left me. I could feel their eyes on me, watching from the shadows. In the days that followed, I couldn't escape that unease. My parents remained oblivious, or perhaps they were part of it all along. What had I uncovered? And more importantly, was I safe? The line between reality and nightmare had blurred, and I was left haunted by the chilling knowledge that sometimes the monsters we fear are not lurking in the dark, but rather, they are the people we trust the most. The haunting of apartment 3B. Every night, I was tormented by the sounds from my neighbors. It began quietly, just eerie noises echoing through the walls, originating from their bathroom. But soon, the disturbances escalated, spreading throughout my entire apartment. At first, it was unsettling sounds that made my skin crawl. But then came the whispers, voices urging me to leave, to escape. As the weeks passed, the torment turned physical. I would feel sharp jolts coursing through my body, like electric shocks that left me crumpled against the walls, gasping for breath. The worst nights were those when my partner was working late, leaving me alone in the darkness, vulnerable to whatever malevolent force haunted our building. For months, I tried to endure, but the weight of the fear was crushing. I often found myself on the phone with my doctor, pouring out my desperation. "You don't understand," I would plead. "It's happening to me. The neighbors are doing something." I had a fragile friend named Marissa who had lived through her own battles. She had suffered for years with severe neuropathic pain after enduring long stretches of dialysis. Even after everything she had faced, she would listen to my stories, shaking her head as if the horrors I encountered were foreign to her. "You Dutch people just don't see it," she said one day. In Suriname, we know all about these things. They happen more often there. Her words were a strange comfort, a reminder that I wasn't alone in my fears, even if they seemed irrational to others. After a particularly harrowing night, I sought help from a psychiatrist. She diagnosed me with an isolated delusion, a rare disorder that could potentially be treated with antipsychotics, but I denied any mental illness. "It's the neighbors," I insisted. "They're the cause of this." Desperate, I moved in with my aunt in the city, hoping to find some peace. For a fleeting moment, it worked. I felt safe. But after a medical emergency forced me back home, the torment returned with renewed ferocity. It became unbearable. "Your patient has shown remarkable self-sufficiency for weeks, but we must set a discharge date," the nurse informed me one day, her voice cold and clinical. That news shattered my brief respite. My partner was reluctant to take me back in, and as soon as I stepped through the door, the pain returned with a vengeance, the electric shocks coursing through my body, leaving me helpless on the floor. Each day I found myself calling my doctor again and again, refusing to leave the waiting room until I received answers. My frustration grew with every passing moment. How could I convey the horror that loomed over me? Then, during a home visit caused by a severe flu, Marissa's words broke through the haze of my despair. "The neighbors have moved out, doctor." In that instant, everything shifted. The shadows that had haunted my apartment began to dissipate. The whispers faded to silence, and the electric shocks gradually subsided. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I looked around my home, the walls no longer feeling like they were closing in on me. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps the torment was over. Perhaps I could finally reclaim my life. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to the stillness that enveloped me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been awakened, something that had been watching me from the shadows all along. Was it truly gone, or had it simply bided its time, waiting for the right moment to return? The neighbors from hell. It all started innocently enough. We moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood in a small town in Ohio. The houses were close together, but the area seemed peaceful. My daughter Emily and I were excited to start a new chapter in our lives, but little did we know our nightmare was just beginning. The first weekend, we heard it. Loud music, laughter, and shouting coming from the house next door. At first, I thought it was just a one-time party, but as the night dragged on, the noise only grew louder. Emily, who was only 10 years old, couldn't sleep. I tried to ignore it, thinking it would end soon, but it didn't. The party went on until sunrise. The next weekend, it happened again, and the weekend after that. Every Friday and Saturday night, the house next door turned into a nightclub. Dozens of cars would line the street, and at least 50 people would pour into the house. The bass from the music shook our walls, and the smell of alcohol and smoke seeped through our windows. But it wasn't just the noise that bothered me. Strange things started happening. One night, I saw people stumbling out of the house, clearly under the influence of something stronger than alcohol. Some of them were arguing, others were laughing hysterically, and a few just stared blankly into the night. It was unsettling. Emily and I tried to tough it out. We wore earplugs, played white noise, and even slept in the basement to escape the chaos. But nothing worked. We were exhausted, and the constant disruption was taking a toll on both of us. Finally, I decided to take action. I called the landlord of the property, hoping they could help, but they brushed me off, saying it wasn't their problem. Call the police, they said. So I did. The police came a few times, but it didn't make a difference. The neighbors would turn the music down for a while, only to crank it back up as soon as the officers left. And then things took a darker turn. One evening, as I was getting the mail, one of the neighbors approached me. He was a tall, burly man with a menacing glare. "You called the cops on us," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Don't do it again. If you do, something bad might happen to your little girl." My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, frozen, as he walked away. From that moment on, I felt trapped. Every noise from next door made my heart race. Every time I saw one of the neighbors, I felt a knot in my stomach. I couldn't sleep, not just because of the noise, but because I was terrified of what they might do. I called the landlord again, begging for help, but they just repeated the same thing. It's a police matter. The police, however, couldn't do much without proof of the threats, and I was too scared to gather any evidence. The final straw came one Saturday night. The party was louder than ever, and Emily was crying because she couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of her bed, trying to comfort her, when I heard a loud crash outside. I peeked through the curtains and saw a group of people from next door in our yard. One of them was holding a brick. They were looking right at our house. I grabbed Emily and hid in the closet, clutching my phone. I didn't know what to do. I felt completely powerless. The next morning, I found the brick on our porch. It had a message scrawled on it in red paint: "Mind your own business." That was the day I decided we couldn't stay here anymore. I packed our things, and we left in the middle of the night. We didn't tell anyone where we were going. We just disappeared. To this day, I don't know what happened to those neighbors. But I do know this: sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones in movies or books. They're the ones living right next door. The shadows next door. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After my divorce, my daughter Lily and I moved into a small rental house in a quiet neighborhood in Texas. The house was modest, but it was ours, or so I thought. The first Friday night we heard it: the thumping bass, the laughter, the shouting. It was coming from the house next door. At first I thought it was just a party, but as the hours passed, the noise only grew louder. Lily, who was only 8 years old, couldn't sleep. I tried to comfort her, but even I was on edge. The party didn't stop until the sun came up. The next weekend, it happened again, and the weekend after that. Every Friday and Saturday night, the house next door transformed into a chaotic, neon-lit nightmare. Dozens of cars lined the street, and people spilled out onto the lawn. Some of them were clearly drunk, stumbling and shouting. Others were different. Their eyes were hollow, their movements erratic. I didn't want to think about what they were on. Lily and I tried everything to block out the noise. We wore earplugs, played calming music, and even slept in the farthest room from the neighbors. But nothing worked. The bass from their music vibrated through the walls, and the smell of smoke and alcohol seeped into our home. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the property management company, hoping they could help, but they just shrugged it off. "It's not our problem," they said. "Call the police." So I did. The police came a few times, but it didn't make a difference. The neighbors would turn the music down for a while, only to crank it back up as soon as the officers left. And then things got worse. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, one of the neighbors approached me. He was a tall, wiry man with a cold, calculating stare. "You called the cops on us," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Don't do it again. If you do, well, let's just say your little girl might have an accident." My heart stopped. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I couldn't. I just stood there, frozen, as he walked away. From that moment on, I felt like a prisoner in my own home. Every noise from next door made my skin crawl. Every time I saw one of the neighbors, my stomach twisted into knots. I couldn't sleep, not just because of the noise, but because I was terrified of what they might do. I called the property management company again, pleading for help, but they just repeated the same thing. It's a police matter. The police, however, couldn't do much without proof of the threats, and I was too scared to gather any evidence. The breaking point came one Saturday night. The party was louder than ever, and Lily was crying because she couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of her bed, trying to calm her down, when I heard a loud thud outside. I peeked through the curtains and saw a group of people from next door standing in our yard. One of them was holding something, a can of spray paint. They were looking right at our house. I grabbed Lily and hid in the bathroom, clutching my phone. I didn't know what to do. I felt completely helpless. Thank you for listening to these stories. Hopefully you enjoyed them. Please like and subscribe if you want to hear more exciting stories.